Check. So it's recording.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our speaker in Sweden. Welcome to the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica. My name is Qianyi Lu. I'm research fellow here at the Institute. First of all, apologies for having to switch to Zoom because WebEx did not work well. We couldn't fix it. It is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Timothée Parrique. Dr. Parrique is a researcher at the School of Economics and Management of Lund University, Sweden. He is the author of a French book titled in English, Slow Down or Perish, The Economics of Degrowth. Actually, I'm so glad that I secured this talk a long time ago, because these days, Dr. Parrique is extremely busy. He is on TV, doing interviews, webinars, more interviews for printed media as well. If you Google his name, you'll find page after page after page of Timothée Parrique. Basically a celebrity. His book only came out just last month, and it was sold out in a very short period of time. They had to reprint it 4 times, right, already so far. Let's hope that the Chinese and English versions will come out soon. Apart from the book that just came out, he is also the lead author of a very important report titled Decoupling Debunked: Evidence and Arguments Against Green Growth. How important is that study? It is cited by the IPCC in its latest report. So most of us still think it's very cool to talk about green growth. And Tim wants us to think again. It's already outdated. There's actually already a huge body of literature on degrowth, especially in Europe. But not many people here in Taiwan have heard of degrowth, although there's this book available in Taiwan already. It's called 少即是多. In English, it's less is more. It's written by Tim's friend, Jason Hickel. So this book, highly recommended. Therefore, for scholars and graduate students in the audience, and for myself as well, I think today's talk could potentially be very important because a lot of questions still remain to be asked and addressed in the degrowth literature, and therefore opens up a huge space of possibilities for academic research. Tim will be talking for 50-60 minutes, followed by a Q&A session of 20-30 minutes. So Tim, please.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. It's the first time I do an event in Taiwan. And I'm absolutely thrilled not only to present my work, but also to discuss with you and to have some questions. So now I'm going to share my slides, and I think you should be able to see them. Ta-da. Up. So everything should be all right.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Fantastic. So should Taiwan's economy degrow? That's the question we're going to try to tackle this morning. That's a complicated question. It's a complicated question because I cannot answer it on my own, because I've never been to Taiwan, nor do I have got almost no knowledge whatsoever of Taiwan. But what I do have is knowledge of degrowth. So what I want to do today is tell you a bit more about what degrowth is, where the concept comes from, how it articulates with other concepts like objection to growth, the French collapsology, the newer concept of post-growth, concept of eco-socialism and post-capitalism. So to organize with this concept together, explore the economic implications of these concepts, which is what I've been doing in my PhD thesis. And once I've done this, in general, in the abstract, and with a lot of European examples, because that's economies I've been looking at, especially the French economy, then I'm hoping that together in the Q&A, in discussions, we will be able, with your help, to answer that question: should Taiwan's economy degrow? But before this, and I think this slide is perhaps not necessary since you're already here, but the concept of degrowth is getting increasingly popular. I've been tracking since the onset of the pandemic, since March 2020, the number of media articles that mention the term degrowth. And we're talking about more than 200 per year. So it has been exploding. You can find, of course, criticism of degrowth. You can find a lot of pro-degrowth articles. But the fact is that everyone is pretty much getting curious about the concept. And of course, here I'm only zooming into English-speaking media, not in the US and UK and Europe. But I think the concept is also escaping that boundaries and getting into other countries. Of course, I've got linguistic limitations because I only speak English, Spanish, and French. So I have a limited ability to go and wander into other contexts to know how the concept is doing. But that's where I'm hoping you're going to be able to help me after that. So keep that in the back of your mind to tell me more about how degrowth has been discussed in your region. So on the left, you can see my first baby, my PhD thesis, which I've been writing between 2016 and 2019. I've put a link in the chat and you can download it freely online. It's a very big PDF. It's almost 900 pages. There is no figures. It's really just textual theoretical economics. So not the most fun part of reading, but it gave me the opportunity of really exploring the idea of degrowth, and not only exploring, but also organizing that idea. Because when I arrived into the field of degrowth in 2015, 2016, it seemed to me extremely interesting, but a bit disorganized, at least in my head. So what I've done in that thesis is try to better organize it. And once that work was done, I had to go the extra step because I wanted to turn that very long and theoretical discussions into a wide audience book that could be just shorter, with less jargon, with less numbers, but still rigorous, and would still explain from the beginning to the end what is degrowth, where it comes from, and what would be its economic implication. And that's how I came to write Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance, which came out in September, and which is now creating an interesting discussions in French-speaking country. So today I'm going to try to present a bit of both, because there's in the book you don't find everything there is in the thesis. But for those of you that are really interested in getting deeper into that, all links are on my website. But a bit of history before, because the concept of degrowth itself existed in French before it existed in English. Actually, the concept initially was invented in 2002, and it was initially décroissance soutenable, or ici décroissance conviviale. So you can see this is a magazine, a fairly small niche magazine among ecologists, anti-productivists, anti-capitalist activists and thinkers in France. And in 2002, they published a few articles around this concept of, what you can see, this little slogan on the right, to be like, the end of sustainable development and long live convivial degrowth. So initially, that concept of degrowth was a criticism of sustainable development. And that is strange because you could think like the two go together, as they are just concept promoting sustainability. But what I'm going to try to explain today is that there's subtle differences between the two concepts. And hopefully we'll understand how they articulate around each other. I've also thought I would put together a little buffet of books for those of you that really want to get serious about degrowth. And you see here a selection of my favorite books that have been published in the last 10 years and more. If I were to recommend one to get started, that would be the one that has already been mentioned, and lucky you, it has been translated in Chinese. That is Jason Hickel, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, which you can see on the upper left with a green cover, which is my favorite book to get into degrowth in a way that is just accessible, readable, well explained, and rigorous. And then for those of you that are more focused on scholarship and want a more exhaustive literature review of what has been published in the field of degrowth, you can read the yellow one, The Future is Degrowth. That was published in June of that year. I don't think this has been translated in many languages yet because it is so new, but it is an absolute treasure trove of concept. You get around 100 concepts to understand what degrowth is about. And the authors have done a fantastic job in connecting all of these concepts in list. So there are 8 criticisms of economic growth. There are 3 dimensions of degrowth. There are 5 pathways to achieve degrowth. So if you like well-organized toolboxes, I do as a scholar, then you're going to love The Future is Degrowth. So, and there's also a whole academic scholarship on degrowth. So here I'm talking about peer-reviewed English articles. The first one was published in 2007, and in 2007 there was only three. I'm going to just accept the. Oh. Okay, all good. So I was going to say there was only 3 articles being published that year in 2007. So there was just very few people back then working as PhD, postdoc, and scholars working on that topic. But then the speed picked up. And today in 2022, there are more than 600 academic articles on the topic of degrowth, more than half of them being published since 2019. So in 2022, for example, there will be 100 articles being published on degrowth from diverse fields of economics, biology, anthropology, philosophy, a lot of interdisciplinary fields. Tourism studies is published a lot on degrowth, human and political ecology, of course. If you are interested in that, if you go on my website in other resources, academic articles, you will find a full list of all these articles, which I've tried to classify in themes. So for those of you that are writing master thesis or PhD thesis or wanting to know more about the scientific basis behind degrowth, getting into these articles is a very good way. It's time consuming, but a very good way of understanding what kind of ideas have been discussed in the field of degrowth. Okay. So now what I want to do before showing you a few numbers and examples is to set a few concepts with definitions. And the first division I like to make, when I hear degrowth, for me, I hear 3 things. I hear the 3 different concepts: objection to growth, degrowth, and post-growth. But if you've never heard about the word, I think it's quite good to divide this into 3 steps. The first step is the oldest element within the degrowth discourse. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Meadows report from 1972, also called The Limits to Growth. That's the one on the left, which was one of the first attempts by engineers at the MIT to create a global simulation model to explore the interaction between demography, industrial production, and sustainability. And their result, which is well summarized in the title of their book, is that infinite growth on a finite planet will sooner or later lead to a scarcity of resources or to environmental degradations like climate change. And so back then in the 70s, that was the birth of these objection to growth, this people starting to worry about economies that would constantly expand and at some point create some ecological problems. And to that ecological objection to growth, this biophysical objection, people started to add social objection to growth. So Marilyn Waring, for example, an economist from New Zealand, was one of the first in the 80s to criticize national accounting, saying that what we measure with GDP, gross domestic product, is not really measuring what we would want to grow. It's not taking into account well-being and equality and informal work and a lot of other things. Actually, that focus on growth is leading to the creation of certain injustices. So here it was a social objection to growth. So you can see this objection to growth is basically the first step, starting to criticize the hegemony of economic growth as an overarching goal of policy making. Fast forward to 2002, the birth of Décroissance Conviviale in 2000. As I said, like I've showed you the poster of the magazine in 2002. Here's the book of Serge Latouche in 2006, Le Pari de la Décroissance, the degrowth bet, you could say, the degrowth challenge. And so after objecting to growth, at the beginning of the 2000s, the mood is different. I think scholars and activists realize it, that what has been predicted by the Meadows in 72 was true. Now, they had numbers that showed that economies kept expanding, and that created more need, relying more on the extraction of natural resources and the generation of environmental impact. And so this worry of overshooting planetary boundaries became a reality in many countries of the world. And so in 2002, when people talk about degrowth, they meant, well, now it's just not enough to criticize economic growth as a potential threat, but we must also organize the physical decrease of or certain economies as to be able to come back under sustainable planetary boundaries. Now I'm doing a broad brush definition, and then I'll come back and give a bit more details. What makes this the beginning of the 2000s special is that this reflection on economic growth being a force of unsustainability, and so therefore the need to scale back, to downscale the size of rich economies, has also opened a box of reflection on how to organize an economy that could then prosper without growth. That's the term of Tim Jackson in 2009 in his book Prosperity Without Growth, which is a great book. I recommend it highly. And that is the third piece within the degrowth discourse. I call degrowth discourse because degrowth of these three terms is perhaps the most popular. But when someone talks about degrowth, that includes the objection to growth and the post-growth. And post-growth see a bit like the alternative economy, the utopia behind degrowth, the project of a society and an economy that could prosper without growth. And now what I want to do is present to you a bit of a more precise definition. And I swear after that, we're done with conceptual definitions of this term and we'll move to specifics. But I wanted to do this because degrowth has been prone to so many misunderstandings over the year. People associating degrowth with a degrowth of demography, associating degrowth with a coming back to the past, comparing degrowth to certain practices like the one of the Amish, comparing degrowth to a recession, or so I think this definition is necessary so that from the beginning we evacuate a number of potential cliches that you may have heard about degrowth. So let's start from the beginning. Degrowth is a reduction of production and consumption, okay? So that's pretty much, if you only take this line, the opposite of growth. Growth is an emergent phenomenon. So your economy is going to do something, so people are going to decide to work more and to buy more, and companies are going to decide to produce more and to sell more, and the government is going to implement a number of policies to make sure that businesses produce and sell more, and that consumers work more and buy more. And then if you measure the result of all these actions after a certain period of time, if you measure levels of production and consumption and they've gone up as measured by gross domestic product, GDP, then you call that economic growth. Economic degrowth would be precisely the opposite. So you do a lot of actions at the level of businesses that pushes them in producing less and selling less, and a lot of actions at the level of individuals that pushes them to work less and buy less. And then you have the government implementing not growth policies, but degrowth policies in order to planify, to organize, to make sure that all these process is going smoothly, and to give incentives to businesses to sell more and to individuals to buy less, to sell less and individuals to buy less. So if you measure it by GDP after a period of time, then you would see lower levels of production and consumption, okay? So in that sense, we really have a mirror definition. What's interesting when I say this is that we need to encapsulate, let's say, the wealth of degrowth and the way it's being used by activists and scholars over the years. We need to add 4 elements: sustainability, democracy, justice, and well-being. And here's my proposal of how to include them into a definition. I've translated very quickly my French definition, which I've spent weeks and weeks reflecting on the words. I don't like this definition in English that much, so I really need to spend a bit of time to make it a bit more precise in English, but you will see it's sufficient for you to see the line of reasoning here. So reduction of production and consumption to lighten ecological footprints. So that's very important. It's a selection looking at high intensity goods and services that you would want to try to reduce in order to lower ecological footprint. So it's not a blind reduction of production and consumption. It's a macroeconomic diet where you really want to target what is making you ecologically unsustainable. Planned democratically, we'll see that it is very important if you want to do it while maintaining well-being, because well-being is contextual, and there's no way to know what contributes to well-being except by asking people how they feel about what they produce, what they work, what they buy, what they use. And so the democratic planning of that reduction of production and consumption is a condition, you could say, so that it's made in the spirit of social justice and while maintaining well-being. We'll see that the social justice has to do with where degrowth is implemented, and the different implications for different classes of producers and consumers in a given country. And the well-being aspect also has to do with how we will reorganize the economy in order for that economy to prosper without growth. So this is degrowth as a transition. It's a temporary thing you're going to do to an economy that is in a state of biophysical obesity. And once you've reduced production and consumption enough, and we'll see what enough means, then you enter a second stage, which I decide here to call post-growth. So then your economy will remain in a steady state. So steady state economy is a concept from American economist Herman Daly. In the 70s, he was talking of a steady state economy. So it's an economy that where you have production and consumption fluctuating, can increase a bit, can decrease a bit, depending on needs, depending on technological progress and other things, but you never have exponential growth curves of production and consumption. It's always pretty much steady. I mean, it's in the name. And so in my definition of post-growth, I keep these 4 features that we had in the definition of degrowth in the same order, actually: sustainability, democracy, justice, and well-being, except that they take a different form. So a steady state economy in harmony with nature. So the goal over the very long term is not to lighten ecological footprints, because if you've lightened already, if you've lowered your footprint to a sustainable level, the goal is not to keep lowering it. The goal is just to make sure that it remains in harmony with nature, so that it's somehow sustainably embedded within the carrying capacities of the ecosystems surrounding your economy. Same thing, you can plan democratically a specific transition, a degrowth transition, and you can have an economy that runs democratically where decisions are taken together. We'll see examples of that with participatory budgets, citizens' conventions, referendums, cooperatives, and commons as example of economic democracy, where wealth is equitably shared. This is the principle of justice applied to a post-growth framework. Of course, in the very long running of an economy, if wealth concentrates, what we know is that that wealth being concentrated in one point is often mobilized in order to gather more wealth. So it becomes an engine of growth. That's what we see today in rich economies. And so what we want is an economy that manages somehow to distribute wealth equitably, so that wealth do not become an engine of growth, accumulation, and widening of inequality. And I'll be giving you examples of how to do that. And the final objective, perhaps the most important, in order to prosper without growth. And we'll see that what's interesting about the concept of degrowth and post-growth is this reflection about what is prosperity in a 21st century economy. We've used to define prosperity with GDP. Now we realize that this is perhaps too narrow, if only because it doesn't account for inequality and ecological sustainability. And so we have to find a different definition of prosperity. Okay, so now this was a bit of a long introduction. What I want to do now is to make that a bit more concrete. And I'm going to use the IPCC report for that, because the latest IPCC report, the AR6 that was published before summer, and especially the two, the second and the third report of the second and third working group. So the one on mitigation and adaptation, which you can see here, I've been mentioning degrowth and post-growth. And I find it a very good starting point. So now I'm going to show you how it's been mentioned in these reports. And I'm going to use the way it's been mentioned to better explain the relation with green growth, to better explain a few aspects and to give examples about things I've been talking about, the relation of degrowth with inequality, the relation between North and South global dynamics and stuff like this. So here I'm using the IPCC because I think it's a universally shared document. So it's something that we can use in many different contexts as a starting point for discussion. And the fact that degrowth and post-growth is mentioned several times in these reports means that now these concepts are part of that global discussion around sustainability. And what I'm going to present now, I've explored in a series of 4 articles, which you will be able to find on my website. 1 on decoupling, 2 on degrowth, 1 on sufficiency. 4 articles, which are basically analysis of the AR6 IPCC report. So let me start with decoupling, because I think that's one topic we need to evacuate from the get-go, because if somehow you read the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report, many people only read that. And in the summary for policy makers, you will find these paragraphs. That sounds kind of positive. So for example, on the left, you can see that at least 18 countries have sustained greenhouse gas emission reductions for longer than 10 years. And so you may think somehow, I'm gonna just move this a bit. Sorry, just a second. I'm putting this on the side. Same thing, when you look at the one in the middle, you see not only we've noticed emission reduction, but there's been consecutive reduction rates of around 4%. So you're like, oh, wow, not only have we been reducing emissions in these countries, but they've been reducing them pretty fast. So the summary for policymakers, and those of you that know, who knows IPCC dynamics, know that the summary for policymaker is edited by countries. So there's a bit of a political influence into that scientific document. So what I've been doing in the article is to compare what the summary for policymakers say and what the actual IPCC report says in the text, and also what the actual science cited by the IPCC report, including my own article, so Decoupling Debunked, has been saying about decoupling. And when you do that, you realize that it says two different messages. So this one is very optimist and you feel like something is possible, whereas the actual science on decoupling is way more pessimistic. And I'm going to try to show this in a few slides. So the first weaknesses of that discussion on decoupling is that it only talks about carbon. So here I've put you a donut figure. That's the concept of Kate Raworth, which has been adapted here in a wonderful study by Andrew Fanning and colleagues in November 2021, where they've tried to represent countries' sustainability, many different countries' sustainability, by looking at these 7 planetary boundaries. You can see them: ecological footprint, material footprint, CO2 emissions, phosphorus use, land use change, blue water, nitrogen. So basically, when a country overshoots an ecological ceiling, so for China here in 1992, you could see that material footprint was at a sustainable rate. It was still in the green, right? You can see that it has not overshot ecological ceiling. So material footprint is an indicator of how much in ton biomass, metal, minerals you use in a year as a person. So material footprint per capita in China, for example. But look at in 2015, after decades of economic growth, the material footprint in China has overshot the ecological ceiling. And that's a problem for sustainability. Same thing for ecological footprint, almost same thing for CO2 emissions. So here, that measurement is telling us different stories. It tells us that sustainability is not only a matter of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a matter of water use, metal availability, local air pollutions, for example, in cities. It's a matter of overall impact on biodiversity. It's a matter of soil fertility. It's a matter of, use of land and deforestation and many different other things that connect together in a systemic fashion. So my first criticism of that fake optimism we have around around green growth is that it only focuses on carbon, okay? But it doesn't look at the other indicators, which you can see in the case of China, are going in the direction of an overshoot. That overshooting pattern you can find in all high-income countries. where consistently when an economy grows, it's going to push these boundaries into overshoot. This, I take the case of Spain because it's the only country, and that's a report that was published in May of this year, that has done this decoupling study with not only carbon, but with 16 indicators of 16 environmental indicators, which you can see here. So the dotted line in black is GDP, so the Spanish GDP. And all the colored lines each represent a different environmental pressure: land use, particulate matter, fossil resource use, acidification, climate change. And what we see is that indeed, for certain things, we can see decouplings. So we can see patterns where GDP increases and the specific environmental pressure decreases. But in the grand scheme of things, we still see that when Spain as a country produce and consume more, and this includes imported emissions and imported pollutions, then we see the metabolism, the overall donut impact increasing. We see overshoot levels worsening. And I give you another example. We've talked about material footprint in China. Now this is material footprint globally, this curve that shows, the global amount in gigaton of metals, biomass, materials, energy that we extract from nature every year. So that was 28.6 gigaton in 1972, the year of publication of the Club of Rome's report, Limits to Growth. And that has come to around 100 gigaton today. What you see is that this increases. If you look at the planetary boundary, meaning what scientists recommend is the threshold of resource use, we should not overshoot. It's here. It's 25 billion tons per year. So that shows you that the challenge of making an economy sustainable is not only about just reducing carbon footprint, it's about also reducing here material footprint. And reducing material footprint while producing and consuming more is almost an impossible challenge. So now let me make a subtle point. And I think this was the main point we made in Decoupling Debunked in the summer of 2019, is to say that people talk about decoupling and green growth, but they do not specify how green and how big that decoupling is. So coupling, you can see the red curve and the pink curve. We know what that is. It's just you get GDP rising and environmental pressure, whatever that is, greenhouse gases, water use, material footprint rising. Okay. Most decoupling we observe are relative. This is the yellow curve, meaning per point of GDP, the intensity of energy use, of carbon emissions, of impact on biodiversity, it's being reduced, but it's not being lowered because the rise of GDP is faster than the gains of efficiency you get per point of GDP. So it's not solving your problem. If, for example, you want to reduce, you want to mitigate climate change, you want absolute reduction in emissions. Relative decoupling is not leading you there. So what you need is what we call absolute decoupling. Absolute decoupling is that situation here represented by the orange curve where GDP rises and your measure of environmental impact and resource use decreases. And this has only been observed, and I will show you numbers very soon, in a tiny amount of countries and only for carbon. But even if that is the case, even if you have absolute decoupling, that is not sufficient because reducing carbon emissions by 1% per year is no use if you need to reduce it way faster to, for example, maintain global warming to a 1.5 or 2 degree target. So what you need is sufficient absolute decoupling, and that's the green line. So you want your emissions to reduce big enough and fast enough so that you fall back within the planetary boundaries. So you remember the donut with the red overshoot. So you want to get back into the green zone, and you want to get back into the green zone before creating some potentially irreversible damage to ecosystems. So for me, if we talk about green growth, either we have a green growth that is the green line here. So that is just, global, including all of the impact that we care about, that is big enough, that is fast enough. But if we just only have the yellow line, then that is not a solution. If you only have the yellow line, then you will have to do some degrowth. And the problem is that green line, we've not seen it anywhere in the history of our species, anywhere in the world, even in the most environmentally active, even in the easiest countries where to lower environmental pressures, even in countries that have had a steady state economy because they did not manage to grow for several years. Even these countries have not managed to get the green curve. So that's an example of a study cited in the IPCC report that tries to measure how big the decoupling is in this handful of countries that have experienced an absolute decoupling. So remember, the absolute decoupling here is either the green or the orange curve. So these are the only countries in the world that have experienced absolute decoupling. And so you can see on the left, Sweden, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and it's a study from 1970 to 2000, what was it? I don't remember, 2019, I think. And on the right, you can look at the emission reduction per year. So the colors, the shades of yellow, green, blue, shows you how fast are emissions being reduced. If it's yellow, it's just not much, it's less than 1%. If it's blue, it's a lot, it's more than 4%. But then on the left, it shows you how fast it should be. That's the little box at the bottom right, you can see with the pink, the green, and the yellow. So the pink, for example, is the emissions reduction rates you would need per year in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees with more than a 50% probability. So we can see that the spread of reduction is in between 5% and 8% per year. And we see also that no countries whatsoever has managed to achieve such reductions. So what we see in the study, and if we were to do it now, the result would be even worse, because the rise of global emissions means that every year where emissions keep rising, it means we need to accelerate rates of reduction in order to limit warming to 1.5. So basically, this idea of sufficient decoupling becomes more difficult to get every single year where global emissions keep rising, which is the case. So that figure shows us that basically where we've observed decoupling is just not fast enough. And that is being explained by a variety of reasons. One of my favorite is this rising energy expenditures, which is a very simple concept to understand. It's the low-hanging fruit analogy in economics. When you're looking for a resource, you're going to take the one that is easiest, cheapest to get. If you can drill oil in your garden at 400 meters under the ground, you're going to do that first before going to the North Sea and pumping oil, at 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers underground. Of course, you're going to do that first. And when there's no more oil in Texas, then you will have to just move to another more difficult to extract resource. More difficult to extract resource means that more energy must be sacrificed in the process of extracting energy. Or metals, the concentration of metals decreases, so it takes more effort to gather the same quantity of metals. This slows down your decoupling because it means to get the same quantity of resource, you need to use more resources. This is the concept of energy return on energy invested, EROIs. And so for me, when I'm looking at this decoupling, there are more reasons warranting that decoupling in the future is going to be more difficult than in the present because of reasons like this. But and then I think I'm going to skip on that, or just one word on the rebound effect. And also, one reason that makes decoupling very difficult to achieve in these growth-based economies, that every single time you free a resource, let's say some of you decide to eat less meat or to stop flying because, well, you've watched environmental documentaries and you've decided that was the right thing to do for yourself. So, but you fly less, so the plane company is going to be, oh wow, look, we have problems selling tickets because people are environmentally aware, so we're going to create some more advertisement, or we're going to lower the price of our tickets, and then that reaction is going to attract new flyers that maybe didn't have enough money to fly, but now with the sales, they will be like, okay, now I can finally fly. And so we call this rebound. So the emission you saved through your decision not to fly is going to rebound somewhere else in the economy because of the reaction of the most likely for-profit airline that is deciding to do something to boost their sales. So that comes back to one economic implication of degrowth, is this idea that we must make sure that decreases in consumption are reflected by proportional decrease in production. They are reflected in proportional decrease in consumption. It needs to be a virtuous cycle as to avoid rebound effect within countries and in between countries. Okay, so let me now talk a bit about, that was how degrowth was mentioned in the IPCC report in reflection to the concept of green growth and decoupling. But now let's look a bit at degrowth in itself. And that's from the adaptation report, so the working group 2. And degrowth is mentioned a few times, but these are the two most interesting mentions. The first one I love most. It's from chapter 18. That's the last chapter of working group 2. And post-growth here is mentioned as a paradigm of development, saying like there are just 5 perspectives on development since the 1950s. You can see them on the left: development as economic growth, development as distributional improvement, development as participation, ta-da-da, ta-da-da. And here comes the 5th one, development as post-growth. And that's quite interesting because you see here that post-growth and here degrowth, you can see they're in the same sentence. They come as a different perspective on development, so therefore as prosperity. This is, while decoupling and green growth was a very, not pragmatic, but technical solution. It's not talking about a relation to nature and work and the way we organize businesses, just like, oh, we have emissions, we maybe need to tax them, and we hope that's going to do the job. Post-growth is a more ambitious concept in the sense that it just is a different view on development altogether. And on the right, you can see the concept of sustainable degrowth, which is interesting here because it really mentions this idea of managing without growth. That's the concept from Canadian macroeconomist Peter Victor in his book from 2008, Managing Without Growth. But it just really mentioned that degrowth is not the same as negative GDP growth. So it's not a recession. I've already mentioned this. But there's this idea of going beyond criticizing economic growth. That's the objection to growth I've described, and including positive concept of social justice and well-being. Let's switch now to working group 3 on mitigation for 2 other interesting mentions of degrowth. The first one is on the intersection between degrowth and well-being. So that's the interesting bit, is you could think that degrowth being this concept of macroeconomic diet, that it would necessarily come with a sacrifice of well-being and happiness. But in the literature, and oh, do I have, yes, it's over there, sorry, it's far. In the literature, there's this relation between degrowth and well-being that is a bit more complex. So this is the World Happiness Report ranking. It's an indicator that tries to rank countries based on happiness measured in many different ways. And what's interesting when you look at this list, and you can see that GDP is only part of what determines well-being. And you have countries like Costa Rica in number 6 position, number 16 here, that is having 1/3 of the GDP of France, that is position 21. So you see that, and even like the happiest countries in the world, Finland, Denmark, are not the richest countries in the world. As you can see, the US is only in position 19, the US having one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. Another way of looking at this strange relation between national income, GDP per capita, and happiness is in that study I've already mentioned before, using the donut of Kate Raworth. And that's a complicated figure. Let's ignore the one on the left and just look at the one on the right. So these, every point of the country, the vertical axis measures social performance. So the highest you are in the vertical axis, the more happy, the highest life expectancy, education levels, available income, highest happiness you are. And the horizontal axis represents levels of overshoot. So if you're at 0, it means you've overshot 0 planetary boundary. If you're very much towards the right, it means you're in a situation of biophysical overshoot. So no surprise here, you see Australia, United States, super high levels of ecological overshoot, huge red on the donut. And you see countries, Norway, Finland, Uruguay, Germany, Austria, with lower levels of overshoot, but overshoot nonetheless. And then you see countries like Costa Rica and Mauritius with more controlled levels of overshoot. What's interesting in that figure, and now I want you to look at the purple countries, is that all the purple countries, they have roughly equivalent levels of social performance. So again, when it comes to life expectancy, levels of education, quality of public services, levels of happiness, employment, all of that. But they have a wide diversity of ecological footprints. So that opens an interesting possibility to be like, in theory, the United States could just lower its levels of overshoot to the one of Italy without sacrificing any well-being, because Italy manages to be as happy and well-functioning, we would say as prosper, as the United States with a fraction of its ecological footprint. So that's the relation here between degrowth and well-being, to say that this macroeconomic diet can be done while reorganizing the economy so that this economy can prosper without growth. And I'm going to skip that part on modeling degrowth so that I can just have a few minutes to explain the concept of sufficiency, because this is one of the key concepts of the IPCC report, and it might be useful to just compare the link between sufficiency and degrowth. So let's look at sufficiency the way it's being defined in the summary for policymaker of the AR6 IPCC report. So sufficiency policies, set of measures, practices to avoid demand for energy, materials, land, and water, while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. Now, there are three concepts we've seen within planetary boundaries at the end. That's very important. That means the goal here, sufficiency, is not only to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. The goal is to remain within planetary boundaries, all of them. So that alone discredit green growth and decoupling as a strategy, because green growth and decoupling, as we've seen, has not managed to lower levels of overshoot in all the other planetary boundaries, even though in a handful of countries it has managed to start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we have here the sustainability aspect, but let's look at these two words for all. Delivering human well-being for all. And for me, this is one extremely important element of degrowth, which has to do with inequality. So of course, when we're talking of a diet, there is no point of recommending a diet to someone that is malnourished. So diets and degrowth here, following the analogy, should apply to high-income countries, to countries in situation of biophysical overshoot. So the US, Canada, and Australia will need to have a huge degrowth transition to fall back within planetary boundaries. Degrowth in Finland, Sweden, and South Korea will be smaller because the overshoot is smaller. And a transition in a country like Costa Rica or Cuba is going to be also a bit different because you have overshoot on certain aspects, but other planetary boundaries have not been overshot. And so therefore you won't need to work in reducing these aspects. So here we have this selectivity of really having to look at what is contributing to these pressures. When we look at numbers, we see that there's a very high correlation between wealth, income, and environmental pressures. And this is why throughout the IPCC report, we find this very radical and new message of the reduction of inequality is a strategy to mitigate to mitigate climate change. You've seen this number around 10% richest individual on Earth are responsible for around half of total emissions, whereas the 50% poorest are only responsible for 1/10 of global emissions. So here, that number alone gives you a bit of a geographical clue that the degrowth needs to focus on the yellow, not on the green. Same thing, even if you look at in the European Union, where you see on the graph on the left, on the right side, sorry, this vertical bar, where the total emissions of the 10% richest Europeans is exactly the same as the absolute emissions of the 50% poorest households. So here, we also, if you want to reduce emissions and if you want to reduce environmental pressures in general, you need to target, well, environmental pressures where they are. Same thing now for Austria, a study that was published a few months ago, where you can see this correlation I told you about income on the horizontal axis with deciles. So if you're at number 10, it means you're in the 10. If you're after number 10, it means you're in the 10% richest Austrian. If you're at number 1, it means you're in the poorest 10% Austrian. And so you can see the footprint of the 10% richest people in Austria concerning mobility, that's the orange bar, is over 15 tons per year. And so that's more than, 3 to 4 times the carbon footprint of someone belonging to the 20% least wealthy Austrian. So again, here that shows you that the practices of sufficiency, changing mobility, taking airplanes less, less car use, these kind of stuff is going to be huge if you're part of the top, let's say here, 50% richest Austrian, but it's going to be more limited if you're part of the 50% poorest Austrian. This I'm going to skip so that we have a bit of time to focus on another, this concept of well-being. So to be like sufficiency for all within planetary boundaries means that somehow we will need to have degrowth in rich countries, and within these countries, within the most emitting, most intense classes of consumers and producers, in order for countries in the global south to have access to natural resources and climate space, for example, to continue, the building of the infrastructure that they need to meet their needs. So this is why the sentence of delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries is so important and necessarily tied, logically tied to degrowth, Because if you cannot green growth in rich countries, and if rich countries are right now monopolizing the bulk of natural resources on Earth, and if there is an increased need for these resources in countries of the global South, where poverty remains, but that are also facing an increasing impact of global warming, then you need degrowth in the North in order to have well-being for all within planetary boundaries in the South. So that's how I've been tying sufficiency to degrowth in that paper I mentioned, which you can read on the website. Now I'm going to skip a bit because I see that I've been talking a lot. So I'm just going to end up with a couple of slides about degrowth policies. A lot of people were asking about, okay, fine, about the degrowth argument, the way you define it, the logic behind it, no problem. But how do we put an economy into degrowth mode? And with my colleague Nick Fitzpatrick and Ines Cosme, we decided to make an inventory of all proposals that you can find in the degrowth literature. That's a bit more than 1,000 texts, including book chapters and report and policy briefs and articles of all kinds, to see how many proposals were there. So we did this big inventory and we found out like 530 proposals. You can see some of them on the left. Some are just goals, restore and preserve biodiversity, sustainable farming, low unemployment, things you want. And part of these proposals, you can find 380 instruments that are just more specific. In that article that you can read online, we decided to divide it into 13 themes. So if you look at number 13, for example, the theme of work, the most popular, frequently cited proposals for degrowth are job guarantee, work time reduction, social ecological jobs. And work time reduction, for example, makes sense. Remember when I explained what growth was, if you want economic growth, you need people to work more, to produce more, because growth and GDP is a measure of production. If you want to degrow, that's the opposite. You want people to work less. So a planned, organized work time reduction is a good policy to slow down an economy. In the same way that in number 7, inequality, we've seen that the concentration of wealth that is being reinvested to create more wealth can be an engine of growth. So saying that if you have progressive taxation, a cap on extreme wealth, maximum wage, kind of policy like this, that can reduce this growth engine. So it can just also contribute in slowing down your economy. So here, from what I've described, degrowth is each of these leverage points are just ways of putting an economy into degrowth mode. And then, of course, the question is, what kind of leverage points belong to the transition and what do you do first? What do you do first and how do you juggle between sustainability and democracy, justice and well-being, the 4 elements of degrowth? And then what do you keep doing after that transition? So for example, if you have a big carbon cap and share system, some form of carbon rationing in the short term for a decade in order to lower carbon emissions, then you have this. And once this is done, how do you transition into a post-growth mode where you can just then make sure that carbon emissions are always going to remain in harmony with the carrying capacities of ecosystems? I've been talking for an hour now, and I think we should leave the rest of the time for questions. I'm going to leave you with that beautiful slides I found online, and that message that the economy is redesignable. And I think this is the most important state of mind we should be having now, is to not take the economy we have for granted. Every single rule, every single protocol and practice we have in our economies has been socially constructed at some point in time, and so therefore can be socially deconstructed. As of now, we realize that the social and ecological unsustainability of growth-seeking capitalist and socialist economies
is unsustainable. And so therefore we will have to redesign these economies so that they can prosper without growth. And that's the greatest challenge. So now that I've presented this, and I'm going to quit this so you can see my face in full, I'm very much looking forward to hear from you. How much of what I've presented today do you think is relevant for Taiwan? So very much looking forward to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you so much. I cannot start my video for some reason, but can you hear me? Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Okay, so for people who want to respond or ask questions, can you, I forgot where do they raise hand in Zoom, or do they just go ahead?
So you can raise your hands. There's a little button.
Oh, raise hand. Okay, it's in the happy face. Oh, someone, go ahead. I see Hikaru. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm
can you tell us who you are first?
Okay. My name is Hikaru Komatsu. I'm working for National Taiwan University. And I'm not a Taiwanese, but a Japanese. So I do not know whether degrowth is really relevant for Taiwan, but for Japan, I think it's really relevant because Japan's economy has been stagnating for more than 2 decades. And it's kind of unintentional degrowth society. But what I would like to ask you is that you propose several recommendations, like you said that redesign economy, but humans design economy. So it means that we need to redesign our ontology, right? What kind of tools or ways do you propose to redesign ourselves? This is my question.
Yeah, thanks, Hikaru. So that your first point is extremely interesting, to say that a country like Japan that has been for more than 2 decades in a situation that macroeconomists call like a secular stagnation, which is basically an economy that just want to grow but do not manage for some reason to get economic growth. And some macroeconomists, even mainstream macroeconomists, they start to witness similar patterns in all high-income countries. So that's the secular stagnation hypothesis, is basically that economic growth was just a phase in the development of a country, but then in the very long term, it stops. So that reason alone, even if we're not talking about sustainability, is, I think, enough to warrant asking the question, well, if growth is going to run out, maybe we need to reorganize, employment, the financing of public budget, so that it's more resilient to the disappearance of growth. And in that case, I think we have a lot of lesson to be learning from Japan, which is perhaps now like the future of many high-income economies, except of course that Japan has not acknowledged that goal of post-growth and of prosperity without growth quite openly. I guess that will be the next step. But on your specific question, I don't think we need to redesign humans or human nature, in the sense of many practices right now, economic practices that are at the source of the problem, are fairly strange to human nature. For example, the profit motive. So the fact that, a business must be organized around the maximization of financial returns. I think this is strange to us humans, because the way we behave with friends and families is not, it's always the social and even the ecological comes before the financial. If your friend is having issues, if your family is in need, you do whatever you do, and then you settle the money later. But somehow, weirdly, in a capitalist enterprise, it's the opposite. You sacrifice the social, you sacrifice the ecological to make the money. So I would actually just go the other way around. If we were to make an economy that is kind of common sense, that is derived from the oldest practices of human nature, which I think are surrounding old concept of sufficiency, of cooperation, of sustainability and harmony with nature, of sympathy, I think we would get rid of these, of the profit motive, of this obsession with, we would replace GDP as an indicator of prosperity with well-being budgets, like it's been done in New Zealand, or with gross domestic happiness, like it's been done in Bhutan, or these or other indicators in Scotland and Wales and Iceland. Just because I think the pursuit of well-being is more wired with our human nature than the pursuit of GDP, which is a weird indicator that was created by a bunch of dudes in the US in the 1930s. I mean, how is that relevant to the prosperity of Taiwan, or to the prosperity of Sweden, or to the prosperity of New Zealand? It is weird that we all follow this one single, Western crafted indicator. So that will be the start of an answer on that very philosophical question. Yes.
In that sense, so humans are really multifaceted. There is an institution which is always priming us to be really individualistic or make money. But if you change that part, then we do not need to change humans, right?
I would agree that yes to that.
And another point about Japan is that actually Japanese young people are much happier than young people 20 or 30 years ago, because they don't know what economic growth looks like. It's something
that's interesting.
It shows some hope. I will send one paper to you about it.
Oh, yes, please do. Thanks, Hikaru.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ali, you have a question, right? Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. First of all, can you guys hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you. Hi.
All right, hi. Maybe can I speak in French, if possible?
You can, and I will translate if you prefer. Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
But to try to make it not too long, because then I will forget and not be able to translate.
Ok. D'abord, je remercie M. Timothée Parrique, que je suis depuis longtemps sur LinkedIn. J'avais une question à savoir, peut-être, parce que moi, je suis assistant de recherche à Taipei, University of Technology. Maintenant, je suis plus sur les pays, les biopies, the country at the bottom of the pyramid. Quel type d'économie que M. Timothée Parrique préconise, par exemple, pour ces pays-là, par exemple?
So the question that's being asked from a research assistant at the University of Technology in Taipei is asking me, I mean, he's focusing on what he called bottom of the pyramid countries. So yes. I suppose, low income countries of the global south. And he's asking me what kind of economic system would I recommend for these economies. And here, I mean, my answer is, for me, I'm a specialist in degrowth, which means I only work on very rich countries with very big footprints. So I think in the context of a country where many needs remain unmet, the concept of degrowth is not really relevant, because you will still need to grow in many ways. You will need to produce and consume a lot of more things. So in these countries, I think the way it connects is that in order to satisfy needs in low-income countries, you will need to produce and consume a lot of things. And so you will need to have access to technologies, to energy, to materials. And that will be made easier if rich countries stop monopolizing these resources, and if rich countries stop importing a lot of resources from you. So a lot of low-income countries have specialized in exporting raw materials to sustain what has been called by social scientists the imperial mode of living in high-income countries. So in that sense, for me, I see degrowth as a condition for prosperity in the global south. But what I would say is the idea of post-growth, meaning like these countries that have the opportunity not to fall back into the same industrial capitalist mistakes of the high-income countries, this obsession for GDP that at the end of the day is not really increasing well-being. So straight, I think they could apply a post-growth mindset to tell them like, okay, well, we have needs that remain unmet. the goal is to maximize well-being in our countries, not GDP. The goal is to maximize well-being, is to look at the quality of employment, the quality of public services, is to take care of inequality. These kind of rules of thumbs that are very kind of like anti-capitalist, anti-productivist, that have a healthier relation to nature, I think would also help design a development strategies that is much more effective. But here, this is already happening in many countries, and I'm referring, for example, to Buen Vivir in South American countries, which is a very nice cosmology, which I think could have better development strategies than the kind of like Western imposed capitalist recipe for development, which is basically to just privatize, capitalize, export, and boost your GDP, which we know from history is not delivering well-being for all within planetary boundaries. So South Americans should redesign their own Buen Vivir development strategies, and certain countries in Africa should, have Ubuntu-based development strategies, focusing on the kind of prosperity they've defined there, which might be better to deliver well-being for all within planetary boundaries that the European kind of industrial capitalism. And the same thing that, Indians may fall back on the concept of radical autonomy, eco-swaraj, as that was the concept of Joseph Cornelius Kumarapa, the chief economist of Gandhi before the independence, which is also a nice concept of development based on participatory democracy, on food sovereignty, on cooperation and cooperatives and not-for-profit businesses and convivial technologies. So I find that in every country, there are just very alternative visions of prosperity. There's a nice book that's been published a few years ago. They call it the pluriverse. So in that pluriverse, you get many different concepts. So now the economic model in all these different countries are going to be different because they're going to be shaped by different cultural aspirations. What they're going to have in common is that they need to be able to satisfy needs, because you want whatever an economy is made to deliver human well-being. If it doesn't do that, your economy is not working. But then we should, as of now, acknowledge the fact that the Western recipe for happiness is not only unsustainable, but is also not the most optimal and not applicable everywhere. And so that would be my answer. Sorry, it was a bit messy, but thank you for this very interesting question.
Welcome back. I still have like something in the sense that we define like poverty as a set of unmet needs, and people like to alleviate, to come up with a solution with those kind of countries. It seems like decoupling would not be possible, I guess.
That's what's been
When
interesting.
people are talking about when they're talking about green growth.
Yeah, so the concept of green growth comes from the beginning of the 90s. And for a few decades, economists were trying to decouple GDP from environmental pressures. But now we realize that this is a bit of a stupid goal. And we should have, from the beginning, tried to decouple well-being from environmental pressure. So now, like the new studies of decoupling, they don't look at GDP because they realize that GDP is only one aspect of prosperity, one small aspect. What you want is to decouple the delivery of well-being from, planetary boundaries. So we fall back, delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. And in doing that, I think in these studies, we realize at least that you have ways of increasing well-being while decreasing ecological footprint, so decoupling well-being from environmental pressures, if you do certain things that, for example, invest in not-for-profit, cooperative businesses, reciprocity network, more sharing, reduction of inequality. So these kind of policies that are not creating any economic growth in the sense of GDP, but they do deliver well-being and they do help to just keep planetary boundaries in check.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Hi, Tim. Can you see in chat? There's the person 10. He has 2 questions. The first one is the relationship between donut economy and degrowth.
I see it. So first question, For those of you that have read Kate Raworth's book on the donut economy, you may remember that the last chapter, she said she's an agnostic to economic growth. So basically, she says we need to focus on social well-being and ecological sustainability. We do what we need to do to get that, and we don't care whether GDP goes up and down. So even though I agree with Kate Raworth Donut, and I find it a wonderful tool, and I agree with most of what she says in the book, I still think that this argument is a bit controversial, because if there is a coupling between GDP as a measure of production and environmental degradation, and if we want to reduce degradation, then logically it means we have to decrease GDP. So we need to be very clear on that to avoid kind of this compromising green economy kind of argument where no, don't worry, we can still make profit, we can still grow and reduce degradation. So far, I've not seen it. So I think it is quite important that we're clear and acknowledge that no, degrowth means lower GDP. That does not mean necessarily lower well-being, but it does mean that what we're measuring with GDP is going to significantly be reduced, again, in proportion to your ecological overshoot. And question 2, countries used to compete with each other nationally, financially, armor, weapon, Yeah, okay, so that's an interesting geopolitical question, I think very relevant in the context of Taiwan in its relation to mainland China. If you decide to degrow, are you going to get invited by another country that, is growing a lot and so has a lot of military power? If you had asked me this question a few years ago, I would have been, oh yeah, but is it really a risk? But I mean, the invasion of Ukraine, as I think just rendered that debate just very real. Here, the first answer is I don't know. So I'm not a political scientist and I don't know much about geopolitics. But I know this, like if you're a country that is very dependent on economic growth, you're very dependent on natural resources, and you're very intensely creating pressures on ecosystems, which means that the day you don't have water, the day you have a heat wave, the day you're running out of biodiversity, you're going to have a huge problem of resilience and your economy is going to crash. So France right now, in that year, we had big forest fire coupled together with abnormal levels of heat, together with a drought, historical drought, together with the energy scarcity linked to the war in Ukraine. And all of that together means that your economy just cannot function. It just crashes. And so it cannot deliver well-being anymore. So I think here, if we all focus on growth, we know we will all crash at some point. Countries that have started to focus on food sovereignty, on energy sovereignty, on reducing their footprint, I think could get a more effective biophysical metabolism. So meaning that in a time of exacerbated drought or fires or whatever, these countries will still be able to prosper without growth, so to deliver human well-being in these under increasing ecological constraint. So that's my first point is, I think whether we like it or not, and whether we do it today or tomorrow, all countries in the world will have to adapt to these ecological constraints. But you're right that if in a spirit of global competition, if one country decided to just greatly reduce its production and consumption to maximize well-being, reduce inequality, and shrink its biophysical footprint, and that means that it has to sacrifice producing weapons and funding part of its military power, then that puts that country in a situation of vulnerability. Same thing if you are a country that is having a very important dynamic position in international trade, and that is on that power that your geopolitical position relies, you can pressure other countries. And I guess that's been the case of Taiwan, because exactly if your position in a global supply chain, and if all of a sudden you decide, okay, we're going to stop producing, export this stuff and just focus on, well-being within Taiwan, then maybe you're losing a bit of that geopolitical power. Now I'm thinking out loud, and I don't have much of a solution. What I'm thinking as a macroeconomist is that the choice we have now at the scale of individual countries and then globally is either between planned and organized degrowth now, or a collapse that will be suffered, unpredictable, and most likely very unfairly spread later. And we're already starting to see that collapse. So in the same way that we've had this national, United Nations discussions about like how to mitigate climate change and how this is, an unprecedented act of cooperation, I think the next step is to acknowledge the fact that this cooperation around climate mitigation requires the degrowth of these very powerful countries. We should start with them. So the countries that have the means of invading others are usually the countries that have grown a lot. And so these countries anyway are the ones that should start to degrow. So maybe that could be the start of a solution to avoid this and to conciliate a degrowth strategy with a reduced risk of geopolitical tensions and military invasions. But again, that's just the naive answer of someone that is not doing much political science.
So Tim, are you okay with the time if we have more questions?
Yeah, we can have one or two more.
Okay, anyone? You can just go ahead, ask or show your face. Tell us who you are.
I would.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Sally. Is that? Oh, okay. It's Yano. Okay, Sally will be next. Oh. Okay.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Hi, Yano.
Okay, thank you so much. I have two questions. I will mention it quickly. And can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, cool. So the first question is that is the concept of basic income related to degrowth? Because I am also from Japan, and in Japan, because of the economic growth, kind of slowing down, more and more politicians and economists started talking about the basic introduction of basic income, and many, especially younger generation, are seem to be agreeing, and many of them believe that is more likely to be it will provide better well-being, and also people can work less hours and still maintain the relatively similar level of lifestyle. So I was thinking the basic income sounded something like a step towards degrowth. And my second question is that, do you perceive degrowth as a natural stage of post-development that can happen either both with or without efforts after a certain period of time or transitions of generations? Because I think some part of me thinks that it is like a natural phenomena, regardless of the efforts. So do you still think that promoting the degrowth is necessary, or do you think it would happen eventually?
Thank you for these two great questions. Historically, remember this article where we did the inventory of policies, and so basic income was the oldest policy associated with degrowth, because in that 2002 articles where the term décroissance was coined, the one policy that was advocated was for universal basic income. And over the years, of course, there's been more proposals, and now in the degrowth literature, there are 9 different types of universal basic income. So it has always remained part of the degrowth agenda, but it has evolved. One of such evolution was the criticism that, a universal basic income given in national currency would run the risk of a lot of rebound effect and of also remaining within that commodified, monetized economy. Whereas degrowth, one of the goals of degrowth was precisely to build an economy that is more reliant on informal, reciprocal cooperative commons, non-monetary economy. So people have developed a hybrid. I'm going to talk about one in France that I quite like, which is called the unconditional autonomy allowance. So this, for example, is the universal basic income given in 3 different parts. One part is the normal part in euro, which you receive normally, but it's only a small part. Then you receive one part in local currency. So that part in local currency can be a bit more precise, because then, for example, you can use the local currency to buy organic food, but not industrial food. So that allows you to avoid the rebound effect in spending in things you would not like to see growing. And then the third part is what has been called in UK since 2017, the universal basic services. So instead of basically giving cash to people, and these people giving cash to for-profit businesses to get things they need, well, why not just organizing directly public services? So instead of, for example, having like for-profit housing providers, well, they just develop the logic of public housing, social housing, and make sure that, you know, people can have access to affordable housing. So that's the idea of universal basic services, which might be now a bit, has taken more importance in the degrowth discourse than universal basic income at only cash. The second question I don't think anything is a natural stage, I think, in economies. That's what I've learned from economic history, is that any event in economies is always just prompted by specific decisions, and these decisions are always framed by specific imaginaries. If degrowth was a natural stage of evolution, you know, I think many countries, starting with Japan, would have already, you know, transitioned to such a model, because they would hugely benefit in terms of well-being, in terms of equality, in terms of sustainability. But the fact that certain countries remained prisoner of this ideology of growth, even France. So the French government keeps insisting that they need to grow the economy to eradicate poverty, even though in the last 10 years, poverty has been increasing in France. So it's like, there's no correlation whatsoever, but ideologically, people believe that economic growth is progress. And so therefore they try to get it, even though in fact, in numbers, and as scientists show, the thing you want out of economic growth are not being delivered. That's what I've called in my book a false promise. So I don't think it's a natural stage, and this is why I think we will need to have a lot of collective work in reframing this imaginaries, both criticizing economic growth as an imaginary to be like, maybe our generation don't want to spend 40 years of our life just to earn enough money to buy a house that is overpriced because it was owned by a for-profit, you know, company. Maybe we want a job with a meaning, and that meaning is not necessarily to have a lot of money to buy a lot of stuff like it was sold in the kind of like Western industrial capitalist imaginary of consumerist happiness. And this will require a lot of difficult critical work, both individually in relation to travel, in relation to the stuff we buy, in relation to the work we do, is a, you know, very personal relation to money, but also collectively in our views on inequality, in our views of how we work together. So I think there's going to be a lot of work, but the fact that now the concept of degrowth is really picking up speed is showing that I think there's a resonance within our young generation. And now I'm linking this to the calls for desertion that maybe you've seen in France, young graduates that be like, we don't want to work for capitalism, you know, we don't want to work for that. We want to work for something that has a meaning, and we don't care about the money anymore. Great Demission in the US, the Big Quit, same kind of idea. The Lying Flat movement in China is perhaps also a representation of that young generation aspiration for something more than just, you know, making money. I think Sally, isn't it? Oh.
You have to unmute. We can't hear you, Sally. You have to unmute.
Oh, I think Sally is unmuted, but we still cannot hear you. If you cannot solve that, I suggest you write it down in the chat. And maybe in the meantime, someone else can ask a question.
Sally, do you want to try again?
Yeah, unfortunately,
still can't
Sally
hear
is
you.
soundless.
Anyone else want to ask a question? Just show your face. Can I ask one?
Yes.
I have many questions. I think put it very simply, I totally buy this idea of degrowth. I think it's extremely important. I think it's the way out. But at the same time, I also think there's sort of, I haven't read all the literature, obviously, but I have read some, including less is more. And there's still a tinge of naivety. It's because when you talk about organizing society more democratically, of course, that's wonderful, and pay attention to equality and needs and well-being. That's all very well, but the reason we are here is because, to put it very simply, the world is run by bad people, powerful and wealthy people. That's why we are stuck here, and they are still there. And when all those solutions that degrowth literature propose, it's not just a matter of persuading people. For example, Occupy Wall Street it took place a decade ago. And right now, in the US, Trump still enjoys huge support. So it's not a matter of just telling people that there's inequality and there are people lying and we can organize our society better. Those, I call them bad people, but you know what I mean. Those people with money, they have means to propaganda. They can also, whenever they see a new method emerging, for example, degrowth, they have their ways to sabotage, including right now, they can create a war, they can create inflation, they can create financial crisis, so that people will be forced to look at their immediate needs, their immediate crisis, so they won't. And also in the list of solutions, for example, I think it's not possible for degrowth to take place very well planned, organized, and top down. It's not possible. So you'll have to do it piecemeal, piece by piece. And also for that uneven or not perfectly organized sequencing, you also have vulnerabilities. For example, when you talk about reducing working hours to, I don't know, 20 hours per week, I think unless you at the same time try to eradicate extreme wealth, what will happen is that people will take up another job because they don't have enough money to afford a house. Yeah. So you have to do all those at the same time, but it's not possible. The other day, I was having dinner with a group of young professors, and none of us can afford a house in Taipei City. So if that's the case for professors, how can ordinary people accept 20 hours a week, working hours, and not have a decent place to live without taking up a third, a fourth job? So thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a tough question. It shows, I mean, on the later aspect, it really shows the interconnectedness between what needs to be transformed. So as you said, like the working time reduction will only be possible if there is price controls, for example, on housing. So if we apply the logic of the Viennese housing, with most of the housing is social housing and the rest is not-for-profit housing, so they have very low housing prices, so they have a very high access to housing. So we can allow ourselves to decrease our purchasing power only if we manage to get a better access to all the things we need to live. That's true for professors, and that's even truer for people who struggle to satisfy their needs already, or for people that are in a situation of poverty. So I'm thinking about it a bit like acupuncture. We need to find like all the points in the economy we need to activate in the right order so that we enable that transition. And if somehow there is a point missing, that's gonna block everything. And to transition to your first point, the point that is currently blocking everything is wealth inequality. So all you said, and we don't need to call them like villains or bad people, but all what these people have in common is that they have power, and they derive this power from economic wealth. As long as there will be people with extreme wealth that are able to design the rules of the economic game in their advantage, of course, they're going to be blocking any attempt to redistribute wealth and any attempt to do ecological sustainability that relies on the redistribution of wealth. So here I'm very much in line with my colleague Thomas Piketty, that, you know, even though he's not talking about degrowth and not much talking about ecological sustainability, is just been arguing that with levels of wealth inequality that's not only very high but increasing, you won't be able to transform anything in your economy. The only thing you will be able to do is to reproduce the system that you have, that is right now for the benefit of those that have been able to accumulate wealth. So it's a vicious circle. So that's one of the slogans of degrowth from the beginning of the 2000s. The first, la première des décroissances est la décroissance des inégalités. The first degrowth is the degrowth of inequality. And so I know that is not a satisfactory answer, because then you will tell me that, yeah, but to decrease inequality, we somehow need to convince government to implement policies to do that. But then if rich people manage to lobby government not to do this, we're stuck. And so for me as a social scientist, the best thing I can do is to look at countries that have managed somehow to reduce inequality and to look at how did they manage to do this. France, for periods of time, used to have quite progressive taxation of wealth. Of course, that has been removed with the Macron government, but the tools have been in place at some point. And so same thing, Thomas Piketty has been studying the US, and for certain decades, there was very high rates of progressive taxation on income in the US. And so the tools have been there. And now that's, again, where we need sociologists and political scientists to better understand the obstacles in the functioning of our governments and in the link between governments and corporations and rich individuals that are kind of blocking representative democracies in doing these kind of changes that we would absolutely need, not only in order to have a healthier democracy in the long run, but in order to kickstart that transformation. So from a macroeconomics perspective, that's a lot of what I'm thinking about, like this first point of acupuncture of how do we take away the wealth, the accumulative wealth of these people that are right now blocking any change in the system. And then a lot of my colleagues that work more on bottom-up initiatives, local currencies, community gardens, local cooperatives, participatory budgets, all these kind of stuff that have managed to somehow exist in the shadow of capitalism. So there's still a transformation that is happening. So now we need to link the two. We need to think from a top-down perspective, what are the acupuncture points we need to action so that those bottom-up initiatives can continue to develop, so that we can see more shared community garden, more commons, more open access to free public services, that we can see more local currencies, more reciprocity network, more not-for-profit businesses. And we really need to work in that grand, difficult Rubik's cubes in solving and connecting these two levels. I don't have an answer to that yet, and that's part of what my research is about here at university. I know it's a complicated problem, but I feel, and perhaps that can be a nice way to end, that the fact that there are more and more people interested in that concept, and more people like Hikaru, I just saw the article that he sent me, working on these issues, means that we might get better shot at solving these issues.
Thank you. Any more questions? I think it's a last chance.
Yeah, one more and then I will need to run.
Is there a question? Okay, go ahead.
From me. It's not a question to the team, but I'd like to say something from Japanese perspective. 20 or 30 years ago, many Japanese really wanted to buy houses. But now, very few young people really want to buy a house. So I feel that the level of necessity or what you believe, what you think you need for your life changes with time. And I wonder if young Japanese really have the same way of thinking. This is my question to you, Professor. What do you think?
Oh, wow. It's I think I've never been to Japan, so it would be very difficult to answer for the young Japanese, but that makes me resonate with. So to present the book, I've been doing a lot of events organized by students, so with a lot of young people, and they love the concept of degrowth because it resonates with precisely what you said, a new relation to possessions, and people realizing that. I think this very radical realization that, yeah, in order to own a lot of stuff, it means I will need to work a lot. And it means I would need to choose the kind of work that will pay me well, even though that kind of work that pay me well is maybe not what my passion is. So I need to sacrifice on my passion in order to get a lot of money to buy some stuff that at the end is not making me extremely happy and that I could have had in a different way. So there's a disillusion about the promises of materialist consumerism, and these in connection with the revival of concept of minimalism, of voluntary simplicity, of happy sobriety, as we call it in France, sobriété heureuse, the concept of Pierre, the philosopher Pierre Rabhi, of people basically being happy with less. I mean, as Jason Hickel said, less is more. And that allows me to bring another slogan, historical slogan of the degrowth movement, which is moins de bien, plus de lien. Less stuff, more relations. Is less commodities, more communities. I try to translate to be like, if at the end of the day, and that's what sociologists, psychologists, and even philosophers tell us, the true determinant of happiness are social relations, let it be family, or just spiritual, scientific, intellectual, political achievements. Why do we still have a growth-based economy where we should have, why do we still have a quantity-based economy where we should have a quality-based economy? So I think that what you said really resonates with what I've been seeing in the youngest generation in France. And I do hope that these new aspirations will be strong enough to translate into a systemic transformation of the way we organize the economy. And I'm very much looking forward to read your paper. I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if you lose your connections, then you need money, right? This is kind of a process of modernization, I feel. And I would also like to have the opinion of the chairperson, Professor.
Oh, you mean Japanese young people not buying houses?
But still, in Taiwan, people want to buy house.
Yeah, I think this is really not a problem of whether, for example, young professors want to, or young people want to buy houses. I think the problem really is those at the top. They make the housing price so high because it's what Jason Hickel in Less is More, I think he mentioned this. Houses are like every other thing that's necessity for people, but luxury. I mean, those at the top, they want the exchange value. They use the house to make more money. For them, it's not a house for them to live in, but for ordinary people, they need the house to live inside the house. But because it's for those at the very top, the top 1%, the top 10%, they buy house, they sell house, they buy more than 5, 7, 8 houses around the world. It's because they want to the price to go up. And that's why ordinary people cannot afford houses. So in Taiwan, it's a huge form of gentrification, because then people move out of those big cities. They cannot afford the prices of the house. So I think the real problem is that that people have the desire to own a house, or once we have really passed to the stage of degrowth, people have a decent place to live. It's true that we don't need to own the house, but we're not there yet. So my point is, those at the very top, it's very important in Professor Parrique's analogy. It's very important to, when thinking about that punctuation, I think those at the top, the wealthiest, they need to be addressed very early on, because they are the source of many problems. And also, in your answer, Tim, in your answer that you just gave, that I kind of it worries me a little bit, not because what you said was not right, but because, do you remember that in the debate of climate change, emission reductions, those, including fossil fuel companies, they emphasize individual responsibilities. Actually, carbon footprint was actually a PR program of BP. So it is BP, the British Petroleum, that created the idea of carbon footprint. They want individuals to think that it's their responsibility to switch off the lights, to drive less, things like that. It's a PR campaign, but in neoliberal debate, it's been emphasized many times, it's not individual responsibilities. So my worry is that when we talk about degrowth and we want people to consume less and stuff like that, it's very easy for people to think it's my personal responsibilities. I know it's different, but I worry a bit about this problem.
No, for sure. And unfortunately, will leave. I'll need to leave because I have another event in 5 minutes, and I need to change the setup. But I share your worry, and I think as a macroeconomist, and I think if that was the only message of what I've said, is just this focus on personal responsibility is just not going to cut it, and we need systemic transformations of overall economies. That requires, as Hikari said very well, deep changes in our ontologies and personal philosophies, but also, and most importantly, in the way we interact with each other when we work, when we produce, when we buy, when we do politics, and all that kind of stuff. This being said, thank you very much for your attention. And thank you so much for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm feeling very honored.
Thank you so much. I think this is such an important talk. And because of that, I want to remind people who speak Chinese that be patient. I will put up Chinese subtitle, and I will send the link of this video with Chinese subtitle to everyone who participated in this event. And thanks to everyone who participated in this event. And thank you, Tim, very much. Keep up the good work, and congratulations on your book. And do give us the Chinese version of your book, please. Bye-bye. And please send